I am crashing out. What is up with some leftists calling any discussions about racism or misogyny or homophobia or ableism or any of the other forms of bigotry liberal identity politics, or saying that bringing it up divides the working class? Why are self proclaimed leftists falling for right wing culture war bull? It has come to my attention that many online leftists don't seem to understand the entire point of their own ideology, or else they'd at least question some of these talking points. Like, some online leftists really seem to treat being a leftist as a method of self validation or a performance that makes them feel like the smartest, most correct, and specialist boy. And I say boy because this mostly applies to men, though women and non binary people are definitely not immune, rather than as a set of guiding principles for how you interact with people, yourself, the world at large, and how you strive to change the world based on your own skills, abilities, and material conditions. Like a real leftist should. Instead, they're basically this meme. People on the internet. Having decorative pillows makes you part of the bourgeoisie. People in real life. Hey man, how's it going? I've met so many people like this, and it's actually alarming just how many of them there are on the internet. And like, they could all be bots, but what if they're not? What if these are real people with bad ideas? I don't know which one's worse, honestly. Like, yikes, I really thought being a leftist was about using your noggin a little bit and experiencing empathy for other people, but I guess in many cases, it's more about the illusion of using your noggin. Why would you pretend to use your noggin instead of just using it? Come on. Leftist ideology is about liberation for all oppressed people worldwide and about building a better world so that everyone can thrive. But a lot of self proclaimed leftists on the internet are clearly not about that. They care more about being right than about solidarity and dismiss actual concerns that marginalized people have as simple liberal identity politics, which makes this ideology seem completely unviable or irrelevant to marginalized people, the people who would benefit the most from a socialist system and who you definitely want on your side. Talking about queer rights or misogyny or racism or whatever is not liberal identity politics at all. And to claim that it is basically another form of liberal identity politics, which we'll get to. Don't worry. And don't worry, this is not me punching left. These people that I'm talking about are not to the left of me. I've seen these types of people referred to as brocialists, fake leftists, class reductionists, and at their core, they are social chauvinists. And in the spirit of Marxist tradition, I can't just let these self proclaimed leftists and Marxists and socialists and whatever they consider themselves to be continue being wrong and saying goofy, unsubstantiated things without at least pushing back somewhat. And that's what this video will be about, dunking on and debunking a few common social chauvinist talking points like talking about bigotry is liberal identity politics, and focusing on marginalized groups divides the working class, and discussing why this mindset is not only annoying, but actively counter-revolutionary and alienating to the very people you want on your side. And yeah, that's right. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Don't laugh. Before we jump into all that, I wanted to talk about today's sponsor, Aura. Have you ever Googled yourself and been like, wow, there's way too much of my information on the internet? It's kind of terrifying looking yourself up and seeing that your home address, phone number, and other private information is just there online for literally anyone to look up. Not only are data brokers earning billions from sharing that info without your consent, but them doing so also leaves you much more vulnerable to identity theft because sometimes those extra secret security questions, like what street did you grow up on, are literally something anyone can look up online. Yikes! Plus, those sites make removing your info intentionally difficult and sometimes require you to give even more of your personal information to do so. Luckily, Aura takes care of the hard part by automatically removing your personal information from these data broker websites and keeping it off. I know there's a lot of services that do that, but Aura has way more features for basically the same price, all in one app, including a secure VPN, an antivirus, a password manager, real-time fraud alerts for credit and banking, and more. Aura also includes $5 million in identity theft insurance protection in case the worst happens. I'm not leaving myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches and brokers, and you shouldn't either. You can try Aura for free for 14 days at aura.com/revolutionary. In those 2 weeks, Aura will get to work scrubbing your personal info from these data broker sites. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring this video. Now back to the video. I've seen far too many self proclaimed leftists say that talking about a particular marginalized group is liberal identity politics, showing that they don't actually know what liberal identity politics means. Liberal identity politics does not mean acknowledging that people experience oppression on the basis of class, as well as other things that are deeply tied to class, like race and gender. In fact, the acknowledgement of those things is foundational to Marxist theory because race, gender, class, ability, all the things are actually deeply intertwined. We will talk about what liberal identity politics is in a little bit, but first I need to explain why talking about the marginalized experience is not liberal identity politics and is actually super Marxist. Okay, like feminism. The entire point of feminism is to liberate women, right? Oh, but that's liberal identity politics. Shut up! Shut up! My boy, Friedrich Engels, one of the originators of Marxism, wrote an entire text called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, in which he discusses in depth how the first form of oppression was that of the woman by the man, essentially turning the man into the bourgeoisie and the woman into the proletariat of the household.
The modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife, and modern society is a mass composed of these individual families as its molecules. In the great majority of cases today, at least in the possessing classes, the husband is obliged to earn a living and support his family, and that in itself gives him a position of supremacy without any need for special legal titles and privileges. Within the family, he is the bourgeois, and the wife represents the proletariat.
Marxists acknowledge that the patriarchy ensures that women continue performing unpaid domestic labor to reproduce the workforce every single day so that capitalism can keep functioning. And then transphobia and homophobia further enforce these rigid gender norms and the nuclear family. Engels wrote that to liberate women, capitalism must end and be replaced with a socialist system where people are prioritized over profits so that women's unpaid labor can be socialized and women can be introduced into public life, thus ultimately leading to the abolition of the nuclear family unit as the basic economic unit of society. Women's liberation is a major part of Marxist theory and therefore a major goal of Marxist praxis. This is why famous Marxist political figures have said things like, women hold up half the sky, and no nation can be free when half its citizens are enslaved by the kitchen. It's also why every single nation with a Marxist ruling party immediately improved women's position in society. Watch my video about how socialism helps women to see 3 examples of exactly that. And it's also why in socialist Cuba, women were the ones to start a revolution within the revolution. It was Cuban women who completely changed the culture of the nation from one where machismo was normalized and femininity was viewed as weak to a culture striving for real equality by fighting for everyone, including women and LGBTQ plus people, to be equally involved in the construction of society and in the revolution. Because that's literally what socialism is about. It's not liberal identity politics to acknowledge that, and anyone who says that it is simply revealing that they don't actually know what liberal identity politics is. Racism is also not a fringe niche issue that leftists shouldn't care about or just liberal identity politics. It's actually a class issue. Racism was created by white people to justify slavery and colonialism, 2 foundational pillars of capitalist primitive accumulation. It also creates a stratified labor force and effectively lowers wages for all workers and is still being used as justification for neocolonialism and imperialism today. And it's also a big part of why we don't have universal healthcare in the United States. Separating it from class makes no sense. Marx even wrote in a letter that labor with a white skin cannot emancipate itself where labor with a black skin is branded, clearly acknowledging that when the working class is divided by the capitalist ruling class, it is impossible for the entire working class to liberate itself. No one is free until everyone is free. You can't just free white laborers, you have to free all the laborers and the people who can't labor for whatever reason, obviously. Marx also acknowledged the importance of the abolitionist movement in the United States.
In my opinion, the biggest things that are happening in the world today are, on the one hand, the movement of the slaves in America, started by the death of John Brown, and on the other, the movement in the serfs in Russia.
Engels and Marx also wrote about how capitalism disables workers and how this is a feature and not a bug of this mode of production. Engels coined the term social murder to describe an unnatural death or disablement via the circumstances of one's oppression in his text, The Condition of the Working Class in England, in which he identified the impact of capital on the social determinants of health. Karl Marx stated in Capital Volume 1 that
Health officers, the industrial inquiry commissioners, the factory inspectors all repeat over and over again that it is both necessary for factory workers to have these 500 cubic feet of space per person and impossible to impose this rule on capital. They are, in reality, declaring that consumption and the other pulmonary diseases of the workers are conditions necessary to the existence of capital.
These issues of identity are deeply intertwined with class and completely inseparable from it. So basically, saying that talking about racism or misogyny or homophobia or transphobia or ableism or whatever is liberal identity politics is actually the real liberal identity politics, or its mirror image, the opposite side of the same coin. When I say liberal identity politics, I mean an overemphasis on identity that completely ignores class and frames liberation as something that can be attained just by putting people with marginalized identities into more positions of power while keeping the current systems of oppression intact. It is the reduction of systemic oppression to a matter of identity and representation and ignores the economic system that generates that oppression. Liberal identity politics believes that liberating marginalized people can be done by simply reforming capitalism and by changing the faces of power rather than the structures of power. That is because liberalism aims to maintain the capitalist status quo and uses liberal identity politics to get us to believe that the status quo can be reformed by breaking the glass ceiling and getting a black president or a woman president or whatever. As a Marxist or a leftist or whatever you are, you should know that that's obviously not how anything works. Not because identity isn't important, but because class is deeply intertwined with all these issues, and because in a bourgeois liberal democracy or a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, same thing, society works for the bourgeoisie and upholds capital. Doesn't matter who's in charge, the system upholds capital regardless. Saying that racism and white supremacy is a problem is not liberal identity politics. Saying that if we just had more women in positions of power, that would solve everything is liberal identity politics. Saying that homophobia is a problem is not liberal identity politics. Saying that we need more gay and bisexual war criminals, I mean, politicians, is liberal identity politics. Again, liberalism is about changing who has the power within the existing system while keeping the system completely intact. Leftism is about changing the distribution of political power and equalizing it by changing the relations of production and dismantling the class system that requires racism, patriarchy, homophobia, ableism, etc. to function. And that means changing the relations of production from private ownership of the means of production to collective ownership of the means of production so everyone runs society collectively instead of being beholden to the whims of a few rich guys. Which also obviously means fighting to stop the continued exploitation of the global south and having international solidarity with workers and oppressed people worldwide. It means fighting for a free Palestine, Congo, Sudan, opposing US intervention in foreign countries, struggling for peace worldwide. Because as leftists, we side with oppressed people worldwide. Which also means siding with the oppressed people fighting for their rights in your own country. But when you say that only class matters and everything else is just liberal identity politics, you are the one that is declaring that marginalized people somehow exist outside of class and attempting to surgically remove that marginalized group from the working class while treating their struggles as a concern that is separate from their class rather than something that they experience because of their class. You are the one saying that somehow marginalized people are their own separate entity completely devoid of class, and that their needs and goals are at odds with the needs and goals of the working class. So when you do that, you are effectively doing liberal identity politics by treating class and identity as separate and competing categories, which is what who does? Liberals, just in the other direction by ignoring class and focusing only on identity. The liberal says only identity matters and ignores class distinctions. The social chauvinist brocialist says only class matters and ignores how identity shapes one's class experience. Both are wrong. A true Marxist dialectical materialist analysis understands that class and identity are fused, intertwined. They're like this. If you completely ignore identity, that doesn't make you more Marxist, it makes you less Marxist because you're quite literally ignoring the specific material reality and the material ways in which capitalism grinds down members of the working class because of their identity. Women having to do the majority of the unpaid domestic labor in their household is a class issue. Migrant workers working for poverty wages and risking violent deportation to earn some money for their families back home is a class issue. Disabled people being intentionally kept in poverty despite the fact that it's actually really expensive to be disabled is a class issue. LGBTQ plus people living in poverty is a class issue. Trans people not being able to access life-saving healthcare is a class issue. If you don't get that, I don't know what to tell you, but you're not a leftist and you don't actually understand what you're fighting for. And you're certainly not a Marxist and probably haven't even read the foundational texts. Again, by writing off issues pertaining to a marginalized identity as simple liberal identity politics, especially when people of that identity are overwhelmingly working class and impoverished on purpose by the powers that be, you are literally doing liberal identity politics and splitting that marginalized identity off from the working class and declaring that their identity is separate from and has nothing to do with their class, effectively claiming that those marginalized people are a separate thing that we leftists shouldn't worry about because their identity makes them exist outside of class somehow, which does nothing but put identity at odds with being working class, which makes no sense because gay people are the working class, trans people are the working class, disabled people are the working class, black people are the work. Like, come on. By saying that, you are the one putting their identity at odds with being working class, which again makes no sense because they are the working class. Their goals are working class goals. Plus, if you're going to build a mass working class movement, don't you want the working class on your side? That's not gonna happen when you strip a bunch of working class people of their class because they belong to a different identity group than you and experience oppression based on class, as well as some other thing that capitalists decided is worth scapegoating so that people don't blame capitalism for their problems, but instead blame trans people or disabled people or immigrants or what have you. Like, it just baffles me that a self proclaimed leftist or communist or socialist would literally buy into this weird right wing culture war bullshit when it's so obviously nonsensical and wrong. Like, damn, mother. And just to reiterate one last time, class is not separate from one's other identities. One's other identities are not separate from class. It's all connected, bro. That's literally dialectical materialism. Nature is connected and determined literally means that everything is connected to everything else. As my favorite Georgian philosopher wrote in his Dialectical and Historical Materialism, any phenomenon can be understood and explained if considered in its inseparable connection with surrounding phenomena, as one conditioned by surrounding phenomena. You cannot break a person up into their component parts and split their identity from their class. The way one experiences class oppression is determined largely by one's identity. If you think that the oppression that people face as a result of their class combined with their identity is meaningless and that the only oppression that matters is the one that people face as a result of their class minus identity, you are the one that is doing liberal identity politics and saying that class is a separate thing from identity that is at odds with identity. It is not. It can't possibly be. You can't separate those things like that. The needs of the working class are not at odds with or in contradiction to the needs of marginalized people. They're the same thing. When you make society safer and better for the most marginalized, you make it safer and better for everyone. Leftist ideology is meant to be liberatory for all people, not just some abstract working class that somehow excludes any identity outside of the default, I guess, identity of cishet working class white man who was only oppressed on the basis of being working class. And being that default identity does not mean that you experience class oppression in its purest form and that everyone else's experiences are a fringe issue. It's actually just all class contradictions manifesting in different ways depending on one's identity. Having a marginalized identity does not negate one's class background in any way. The CEO of one of the companies I used to work at was a disabled immigrant, which, same bro, but like, that's not enough to forge a bond of unbreakable solidarity between us, especially because his family fled Hungary in the 1940s to escape the Soviets, which, like, what was your family doing in the 1940s? And this guy had like a nurse come to his house every day. He literally owned like at least two companies and had one of the biggest houses in the area. Actually, the biggest house in the city he lived in. So, like, that's not most disabled people's experience. Do you think trans people who are bourgeois are struggling to access hormones? Do you think Pete Buttigieg is gonna get a hate crime for being a homosexual? No, bro. But working class people with those backgrounds are at risk of government violence constantly because they are working class, and the government uses their identity to enact that violence against them. Come on, like, obviously, identity does not magically determine one's class background. However, given that the working class is the larger of the two classes, the majority of people in any given identity group will probably be working class because that's how math works. Talking about trans issues divides the working class. This is dividing the working class. The working class is already divided. The ruling class already did that and continues to do that. Otherwise, they wouldn't be the ones actively trying to suppress trans people, push them out of sports, push them out of public life in general, remove their access to necessary medical care, all of which increases the suicide rate for this already vulnerable group and is a form of social murder. Engels. This is not the book, that's Origin of Family. The division of the working class has already happened, and trans people certainly weren't the ones to do it. Do you know who divides the working class? Is it marginalized, oppressed people who just want to live their lives, or the ruling bourgeois class who benefits from scapegoating those same people so people outside of that marginalized group will blame the marginalized group for the failings of capitalism instead of blaming capitalism and fighting to implement a new system? Are trans people or immigrants or whoever dividing the working class? Or is it the bourgeoisie who would benefit from a divided working class that are doing that? Also, like, why would marginalized working class people who are suffering the most under capitalism and who would benefit the most from the rest of the working class upholding and supporting their struggles, why would they divide the working class? Why? Answer me. You can't. Because that's a goofy non-argument. This is also what happens when you don't read theory or if you only read the foundational texts but nothing beyond that. Like, of course, the foundational texts are important for understanding the philosophy of Marxism and you should absolutely read them, but you need to understand the material conditions of the working class where you are now. And you can't do that when you are writing off sections of the working class and claiming that discussing their issues that are particular to them not only because of their identity group, but because they are also working class like you, and thus have no power to enact change on their own behalf in this dictatorship of the bourgeoisie without building collective power, just like you, is not important. Also, if you consider yourself a leftist or a Marxist or whatever, and you live in the United States and your principles, your praxis, everything about your ideology is not rooted in the Black radical tradition and inspired by the Black Panther Party, then you don't really know anything about Marxism. Much like how Lenin taught us that the working class cannot just seize a bourgeois state, but has to smash the state and construct a brand new proletarian state, which is what he did with the Soviet Union, and added to the Marxist canon by literally showing us how seizing and maintaining state power is done via a highly educated and dedicated vanguard party adhering to the principle of democratic centralism. The Black Panther Party also added to the Marxist canon and showed us how Marxism can be applied to the material conditions of the United States. Of course, that was decades ago. We have new material conditions now, but their work is still an important facet of Marxist history. And if you live in the US and consider yourself a leftist, you need to know about them. The Black Panther Party showed the value of international solidarity with oppressed people worldwide, the importance of organizing the most marginalized communities who are suffering the most under capitalism, and the need to build dual power and essentially create parallel government programs, which they turned survival programs, to make up for the failures of the government itself and show what can actually be done to meet people's needs. They literally addressed and sought to improve material conditions while building revolutionary consciousness and educating their communities. Plus, a very important aspect they added to the Marxist canon is the need to organize the lumpen proletariat rather than writing them off as automatically reactionary like Marx incorrectly did. This would be like your unhoused people or workers or anyone who works in the informal economy like drug dealers. And the young lords who were inspired by the Black Panthers and who also did incredible things literally started off as a gang. The Black Panthers also recognized that to build a mass working class movement, yes, start in your own community, absolutely, but extend that same solidarity to other people fighting for what is basically the same thing. The Black Panthers started off organizing Black people who they considered to essentially be colonized people within the belly of the beast, a colony within the US empire itself. But they also built solidarity with other oppressed people both at home and abroad because they understood that they were all fighting for the exact same thing: the liberation of all oppressed people worldwide from the shackles of Western imperialist hegemony. Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party, even gave an entire speech in response to the homophobia and misogyny of some of the Black Panther Party membership, showing that he understood the interconnected nature of oppression and the fact that women, gay people, and Black people are all oppressed by the same systems. Remember, we have not established a revolutionary value system. We are only in the process of establishing it. I do not remember our ever constituting any value that said that a revolutionary must say offensive things towards homosexuals or that a revolutionary should make sure that women do not speak out about their own particular kind of oppression. As a matter of fact, it is just the opposite. We say that we recognize the woman's right to be free. We have not said much about the homosexual at all, but we must relate to the homosexual movement because it is a real thing. And I know through reading and through my life experience and observations that homosexuals are not given freedom and liberty by anyone in the society. They might be the most oppressed people in the society, and what made them homosexual? Perhaps it's a phenomenon that I don't understand entirely. Some people say that it is the decadence of capitalism. I don't know if that is the case. I rather doubt it. But whatever the case is, we know that homosexuality is a fact that exists, and we must understand it in its purest form. That is, a person should have the freedom to use his body in whatever way he wants. This is not endorsing things in homosexuality that we wouldn't view as revolutionary. But there is nothing to say that a homosexual cannot also be a revolutionary. And maybe I'm now injecting some of my own prejudice by saying that even a homosexual could be a revolutionary. Quite the contrary. Maybe a homosexual could be the most revolutionary. The Women's Liberation Front and Gay Liberation Front are our friends. They are our potential allies, and we need as many allies as possible. So, yeah, the ones dividing the working class are the ruling class. And the people who are saying that marginalized people caring about issues that impact them is liberal identity politics. Yeah, that divides the working class, unlike talking about issues that are particular to your identity group. Capitalism upholds patriarchy and white supremacy. That means that, yes, the majority of white cis-het working class men are struggling under capitalism, just like other people, but they are also granted far more concessions than any other identity group from the ruling class so that they can keep perpetuating capitalism rather than fighting against it. In the US, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, are the ones who divided the working class from the very inception of this country by creating the category of whiteness in the first place and building a country around meeting the needs of the white landowning man. Like, do motherfuckers not know US history? They don't, because if they did, they'd understand that what we are dealing with today in the US is a direct consequence of the white supremacist patriarchal bourgeois liberal ideology that built this country specifically to cater to the white landowning man. If you aren't fighting for the rights of the most oppressed and marginalized populations, trans people who are constantly in danger of having their healthcare ripped away from them, disabled people who are intentionally kept in poverty and who still don't have marriage equality, Black people whose ancestors were ripped from their land and forced into slavery so some white heads could get rich off of their unpaid labor, Indigenous people who are still kept impoverished on purpose by the government after they attempted to completely eradicate them and then push them onto reservations, sex workers whose livelihoods are largely criminalized and who, even when their work is perfectly legal, still deal with banking and housing discrimination. If your fight is not for those people, then who's it even for? Who are you fighting for? Yourself? Girl, bye. You're dividing the working class, and you're doing liberal identity politics. Are those people not working class? They are. In fact, they probably have better criticisms of the systems of oppression that are at play than you do. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Don't laugh. When Lenin says that, he's talking about motherfuckers like that who appropriate Marxist rhetoric so they can look cool and intellectual and feel correct and smarter than everyone, even though all they're doing is just being shitheads. Marxist in words, not in deeds. I keep saying you, but I know not everyone watching this is a shithead, and if you are someone who does fight for the oppressed and powerless, shout out to you. You understood the assignment, because that's what the entire point is. And let me know if that's you, because boy, there's way too many so-called Marxists who are actually just social chauvinists who want to improve material conditions for themselves and don't care about building coalition with the people who are most oppressed. Honestly, I feel like all the social chauvinists have probably clicked off this video now, but if you're still watching it, I hope you're learning something. Who cares about minority group? We should focus on the majority. What? That's a really bad practice. Source: I have a master's degree in human factors and ergonomics, and I can tell you with 100% certainty, because this is a foundational principle of human factors and design. When you design a system, you should absolutely design for the extremes and not the average, because if you design for the average, then you design for no one. That's literally the 5th and 95th percentile rule. Like, you wouldn't design doorways for the average 5'10" male because everyone taller than that would hit their head. If you design any system for the average person, you are similarly leaving out a whole bunch of people and making it unusable for them. Like, literally, what's with leftists being like, lol, who cares about this marginalized group? We should focus on the majority. I actually repeatedly say in my videos that when you design for the average, you design for nobody, and when you design for the extremes, the outliers, the marginalized, that improves society for quite literally everyone, which is consistently true. I mean, you see this with things like the curb cut effect and with other accessibility measures that have improved life for everyone. Okay, so about a quarter of people are disabled, probably more, but internalized ableism makes it hard for people to admit to being disabled. That's a ton of people. It's statistically pretty likely that around 1 in 4 people you know probably has a disability of some kind, and you yourself will probably one day become disabled if you're not already, unless you perish before that. If you lived in a society where disabled people actually received more benefits from the government and had a safety net so they could always access housing, food, healthcare, education, and a job placement program if they happen to recover or want to work a part time job or work from home or what have you, that'd be way better for literally everyone because everyone is at risk of becoming disabled. Think of how much more secure you would feel knowing that you'll be taken care of no matter what happens to your physical form. If you decriminalize work, you make your community safer by reducing the risk of violence against members of your community. Because decriminalization is the best way to reduce violence against sex workers. If sex workers could report assault to the police without getting arrested, ACAB obviously, I'm an abolitionist, that makes the community that they are a part of safer, or at the very least, reduces police violence against sex workers. And we know that cops typically don't do their jobs, but SWs can at least report crimes against them without getting arrested if there's decrim. Otherwise, if they go to the police, they're just going to get arrested for their literal job. If you empower the Black American whose ancestors were enslaved and robbed of the prospect of generational wealth, then forced into disabling jobs and living conditions via things like redlining, further reducing their ability to access generational wealth, then denied access to a good education because of the way that education is funded by property taxes, again, reducing their ability to access generational wealth, what would that mean for you? Or if you empower the indigenous people of this land who have been forced into poverty and pushed onto reservations after the government's attempt to completely eradicate them and strip them of their culture and their connection to their land and ancestors, what would that mean for you? If a group that has historically been extremely oppressed gains more rights and more access to education, housing, all the necessities one needs to thrive, that means anyone outside of that group who has not experienced that particular form of oppression will also have more rights, and their access to those things will definitely be guaranteed. Why do people not understand that this is absolutely how it works? One group getting rights has never led to another group no longer having those rights. Come on, use your noggin, please. If trans people can access their gender affirming care, much of which is medication that cis people very commonly use, that makes it easier for cis people to access those medications. If trans men can access testosterone, that means that cis men with low T are not at risk of having their TRT ripped away from them. If trans women can access estrogen, well, that's great because menopausal cis women also need that, and they'll for sure have access to it when trans women do. How is this hard to understand? Capitalism uses a divide and conquer strategy where it makes people hate other people because of the identity group that they belong to rather than because they're like fucking assholes who exploit their workers or something, like actually real. It has been using this strategy since the beginning. I mean, the capitalist US was literally built off of racism, misogyny, the enslavement of black people kidnapped from Africa, and the genocide of the indigenous people. It was built off of a divide and conquer strategy, and it was built off of framing black and indigenous people as stupid, foolish, inferior, and thus not worth listening to and deserving of the violence they face. The American government is an expert at using this strategy. It's had centuries to hone it at this point. So why are so-called leftists letting that conditioning work on them? Insert identity group here is foolish, inferior, and thus not worthy of listening to and deserving of the violence they face. Oh, wow, some leftists, you are being totally susceptible to obvious capitalist conditioning like that. Like, what? The liberal ideology that America is founded on is literally one that justifies and endorses racism. And since bigotry is intersectional, it's not hard for these people to introduce more groups to hate. Also, historically, when trans people have gained visibility, like in the 1920s, fascists were the first ones to dehumanize them, like Nazis looting and burning books from Hirschfeld's Institute, the Nazis making sex testing a thing in the Olympics. Specifically because fascism is what happens when capitalism can no longer deal with the weight of its own contradictions. When stuff is way too expensive and you can't afford a house or groceries and everything keeps getting way more expensive and everything sucks, the capitalist ruling class and the politicians who align with them, which is all of them because bourgeois democracy is like that, well, they certainly can't blame capitalism for it because that undermines the stability of the entire system. But they can blame trans people for why you're so goddamn unhappy, or homeless people, even though homelessness is just a policy failure on the part of these politicians and could easily be fixed, or immigrants, even though borders are made up. But the bourgeoisie basically just make up reasons to hate these vulnerable populations because the alternative is destabilizing the very system they benefit from. All leftists care about is sex. This is a weird argument variation that I've seen too much on like all the platforms. Usually some variant of Lenin said to be careful about matters of sex, or leftists only want to talk about sex and not anything important. And bro, I don't know how to tell you this, but Lenin is not a god who can tell you what to be interested in or not. And he was also probably a gross asexual, so like duh, of course he was like clutching his pearls at the idea of people talking about sex. No shade to sex repulsed asexuals. That's a fine human variation. You just can't assume that your normal human variation is the standard, which is what Lenin was doing. Because even great revolutionaries can be wrong sometimes, and their words are not gospel and not to be taken as such. Also, there's a lot of people in the world. There's a lot of different potential interests, and one of those potential interests is gender and sex and sexuality. And there are revolutionaries like Mariela Castro Espin, who are literal sexologists and whose role in the revolution, the Cuban Revolution, is to progress the rights of sexual and gender minorities and further the cause of sexual diversity. That's a good thing, actually, and it's good that different people are interested in different things because that is how you maximize human knowledge instead of just trying to force everyone to focus on just one particular subject. It's good to have revolutionaries who are psychologists, or architects, or engineers, or sexologists, or artists, or construction workers, or baristas, or insert any number of jobs here because dialectical materialism applies to everything. It's universal. That's the beauty of it. It's good to have a lot of diversity of ideas and experiences so that we may understand the experience of what it means to be human more fully. Like, we are all individuals, but we are all part of the same thing, the same collective whole of humanity. And I want a world where every individual in that collective whole can come to full fruition and use their skills and abilities to their fullest possible expressions. This means that I need to be okay with people studying things that I may not be interested in and being different from me. Well, I am okay with that. Like, go write code and be heterosexual to your heart's content. I won't join you, but I hope you have fun. I'm going to be reading about Cuba's gay revolution instead. There were also revolutionaries like Alexandra Kollontai that wrote about these taboo topics too, about what sex and love will be like under a dictatorship of the proletariat. There were also revolutionaries like Miss Major, rest in power, who was a literal trans sex worker and who loved it, and who did more to further the revolutionary cause by taking care of trans women in San Francisco and keeping people alive when the state had abandoned them than any of these "why should we care about trans people" motherfuckers ever have. And like, have you heard of Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera? Two trans sex workers who started the organization Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which was influenced by the Black Panthers and which also provided food and shelter to meet the material needs of LGBTQ plus youth, a particularly vulnerable group in society. There are also so many revolutionary strippers and porn stars and pro doms and full service sex workers. And in fact, these people tend to be more revolutionary than your standard worker because they are on the margins of society. Because they are denied things like housing, risk having their bank accounts frozen, deal with censorship and suppression constantly, and literally had their ways of vetting clients online taken away with Fosta Sesta and forced into more precarious conditions. So they're actually fed up with the current system and are doing something to try to change it. They are also acutely aware of the fact that they are canaries in the coal mine. When their rights are stripped, that is a sign that yours are about to be too, and they make it known. People just don't listen because of the combined mindsets of "sucks bad. We should focus on the majority and caring about marginalized groups is identity politics and dividing the working class. Workers fight to further their rights like constantly. Unionizing strippers, bro. Those are the exact people I want on my side. People who are already radicalized by their material conditions and who are inclined to fight to improve those material conditions. I'm not even saying to fight for other people specifically because it's good for you. You should do it because you care about others and want everyone to have a chance at a good life with access to everything they need, even if they're different from you. Because guess what? People are going to be different from you, and that's okay. But some leftists seem to have this tendency to adopt socialist rhetoric, but unlearn nothing that's been taught to them simply through living in a capitalist nation and end up falling into this weird form of toxic individualism where they think they understand all possible variations of the human psyche and form and can put limits on that based on their own biases while believing that the ideal society must cater to them specifically and not caring about others. It's so goofy, bro. And extremely illogical, as I just outlined in depth. Che Guevara said that, at the risk of seeming ridiculous, let me say that the true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love. It is impossible to think of a genuine revolutionary lacking this quality. And it's true. Your love of the masses and of humanity should mobilize you and make you strive to improve things for your community or your household or some corner of the world that you have access to, whatever that may look like based on your skills and abilities. Unfortunately, everyone wants a revolution, but no one wants to do the dishes. The actual mundane work of getting there. A lot of online leftists clearly are not coming at this ideology from a place of love at all. They're coming at it from a place of wanting to look smarter and better than other people and to own the libs, I guess. And that's incredibly cringe and out of touch and not doing anyone any favors. What is this, a 2016 anti SJW compilation? The only 2016 anachronism I want is the makeup. If I own the libs, it's purely incidental, not because I've sought out a circumstance in which I can show off my superior intellect and make someone else look bad. I got nothing to prove. I don't need to do that. Why are you trying to prove your superior intellect to anyone? Just be yourself and share your insights and have dialectical discussions with your comrades to determine the logical conclusion of those insights and whether they're worth upholding or not. Better yet, put your ideas into practice in the real world, and if they don't work, learn from that and do something better. That's just me summarizing on practice for you, which is a foundational text. You're welcome. But don't base your identity on how much smarter you are than other people. Just be smart and model good behavior. You don't need to be better than other people to be a complete human being. You already are one, so start acting like it. Revolution requires a mass working class movement, but that always starts with the self and with revolutionizing your own consciousness. You cannot have a successful revolution without building a new consciousness, as many successful revolutionaries actually did, and without actually living by the principles you claim to uphold. That involves unlearning your capitalist conditioning, building genuine connections with other human beings, being in solidarity with all oppressed people worldwide, including in your own country, loving humanity, and dismantling the unjust hierarchies you uphold in your daily life, like misogyny or white supremacy. And of course, organizing and building collective power in any way you possibly can. As Asada Shakur, rest in power, said,
We need a revolution of the mind. We need a revolution of the heart. We need a revolution of the spirit. The power of the people is stronger than any weapon. A people's revolution can't be stopped. We need to be weapons of mass construction, weapons of mass love. It's not enough to just change the system. We need to change ourselves. We have got to make this world user friendly.
as Kwame Ture said,
When you see people call themselves revolutionary, always talking about destroying, 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 but never talking about building or creating, they're not revolutionary. They do not understand the first thing about revolution. It's creating.
plus, you can't really get people on your side if you're fighting your own demons and failing. Sorry, Jordan Peterson was kinda right here. Clean your room before you criticize the world. But by clean your room, I mean you need to embody the archetype of Chiron the wounded healer. Sorry to get all Jungian on you, I will probably do it again. If you live in a capitalist state, then undoubtedly capitalism has hurt you. It might have made it difficult to access certain things that should be a human right, even if that thing is just clean air, though for many others it's access to food, education, housing, good healthcare, any number of vital things. It has alienated you from your labor, the fruits of your labor, your fellow humans, and your own human essence. You will never know who you are without capitalism or who you could have become if you didn't have to work to survive. You will never know who you would have been if everyone had a collective sense of ownership over society and a say in how society runs. When you learn about all this, you have to grieve the life you could have had if only we lived under a system that works for the people rather than for capitalists. You learn that you are in fact wounded and that much of your trauma, something that pretty much everyone has in some form, is likely deeply rooted in the private ownership of the means of production. Rich guys owning everything has probably made your life way worse than it otherwise could have been. It's made the people living under such a system more selfish, less trusting, and overall less kind than they would have been if we all felt a collective sense of ownership and responsibility over society. That sucks. How do you alchemize that pain and use it to heal yourself and those around you? How do you turn that pain and suffering into something good and helpful for society, like what the Black Panther Party did? How can your self knowledge and experience transform society for the better? I mean, sure, you can go on Twitter and drag the new lol cow of the week and jump on a bandwagon to cancel a random trans woman for not being sufficiently revolutionary, according to you, and temporarily ease the pain with a little bit of schadenfreude, or maybe even call me a liberal for caring about queer people, but once that's done, the pain will still remain. And then what do you have left? Who are you when your worth is not determined by comparing yourself to others? Who are you when you are truly yourself? If you were to live out the fullest positive expression of who you truly are, what would history have to say about you? What would your ancestors say? That you were a weird nerd who kept saying that actually this issue that marginalized people care about is irrelevant. I'm a serious leftist, by the way. Or that you were someone who fought against oppression and for the liberation of all and made the world a better place by existing. The two are mutually exclusive, so you gotta pick one. In conclusion, don't just perform leftism, embody it. Don't just read theory, actually do something with it, even if that just means synthesizing it from your own unique perspective and sharing it with others. Use your understanding to be constructive in some capacity. Build something new and beautiful. Unlearn your capitalist conditioning. Let your ideology be guided by that great feeling of love Chet talked about and not by whatever the ruling class has decided is the next culture war issue. Be yourself and stop telling other people who to be or what issues to care about. And most importantly, be in solidarity with other oppressed people worldwide. All oppressed people worldwide. Oppressed people of the world, unite. I definitely won't fix all of leftism with this video, considering how much of it is still influenced by COINTELPRO and other CIA propaganda to this day. But if I could get at least one person to self reflect and do better, that'd be pretty nice. Also, this is by no means a comprehensive list of bad social chauvinist arguments. There are many, many more, but I literally had to stop myself from writing more because this was already getting so long. But if you can think of any other goofy social chauvinist arguments that you've seen, drop them in the comments. Just tell me that that's an argument that people make, and don't. Otherwise, I'm gonna think you're saying that for real. It's hard to tell on the internet, you know? Thanks for watching! This video was made possible by my fabulous patrons on Patreon. If you like my videos, consider joining this fun community for early access to ad-free, uncensored videos, monthly exclusive patrons-only videos that you can help pick the topics of or ask questions for if it's a Q&A, and the ability to yap with a group of insightful, like-minded people. You can also send me a one-time tip on Ko-fi or PayPal, and remember to subscribe if you haven't already, and like the video, and share it with anyone you think would like it. It really helps support the channel. If you've gotten this far, leave me your favorite fruit emoji because we support fruity people on this channel. No class reductionism here. Isn't that right, Millie? She's so cute. Okay, bye.